Welcome back, everyone, to Front Office Sports and Baker Machado in New York. And from the director of one of the greatest sports documentaries, The Last Dance, they're out with another fascinating story. This one focused on one of the greatest and most controversial athletes of our time, 24-time Grand Slam champ Novak Djokovic. The documentary is called The Wolf in Winter, and it premieres on Prime Video on August the 20th, and it'll close the book on a production nearly 10 years in the making. Director Jason Hehir is with us. Jason, thank you so much for hanging out with us. So tell us a bit more about the process in putting this all together and why now was the right time to do a documentary on Novak Djokovic.
Almost 10 years is accurate. I was not there for all of those almost 10 years. This was brought to me in the fall of 2023 or late summer 2023, um, where Novak's team just requested a meeting to talk about, to gauge my interest in telling his story or some aspect of his story. And it was there that they explained to me that he had begun work on a documentary, I believe in 2017. Um, and that went through fits and starts. It was up, it was down, it was up, it was down, and then COVID kind of waylaid everything. And then it was around 23 when they were looking for a new director to kind of give a fresh take on this story because his career, especially in the latter stages of his career, it evolves so much from year to year that the story
Mhm.
changes as we go. And as we found, I've been working on this thing now for a little over 2 years, and
Mhm.
the story for him has changed and morphed as we've been making it. So you always kind of have to rush to the finish line no matter what your window is on these, but this one we've really been kind of building the plane as it's been flying.
For a lot of us who are big tennis fans, we know Novak is notoriously private about his inner circle, his family life, all of that. I guess what was one of the hardest boundaries for you to sort of break down? And maybe is there a moment that really stands out to you with his family or anything else that might really surprise us about sort of the ethos of who Novak Djokovic is?
He is a private guy, and I came in with my own preconceptions about, how robotic he might be, how machine-like he might be. I didn't really know him as a dad, as a casual tennis fan. The first thing that came to mind was not loving father, loving husband. I just knew him as this warrior on the court, firebrand off of it, polarizing, controversial, stubborn, obstinate. Lot of acting out on the court. So I didn't entirely have a negative view of him, but I didn't entirely have a positive one either. Um, so we just kind of got to know each other a little bit to see if it was the right fit, and immediately I could tell that this was a guy who was very curious about me and my story, my kind of background, but also the filmmaking process, which is you don't see that certainly with a big superstar, but you barely see that with any subject that you're covering. You're just kind of a fly on the wall. They let you do their thing if you're lucky. He really wanted to know, how do you start researching? How do you start building a story? What's important to you in telling a story? How do you decide who you're going to interview? Um, and that carried throughout the entire process. He was always willing to give us the access that we wanted as long as I could tell him why we were wanting it.
Mhm.
So what he didn't want was a bunch of cameras following him around just to throw stuff at the wall after 2 years and see what stuck. If you had a plan and you had a reason why we need to be in the car or we need to be at your home or we need to shoot you with your daughter or your son, then he was willing to relent a little bit. So it's as always in these things, it's a very, very slow. There's no shortcut to building trust with somebody. So there's a lot of bricks in the wall that go into that. But we had a couple of years to do so.
We know Novak is pretty infamous for some of his unconventional practices in terms of his success and why he's stayed so successful for so many, different eras, thinking from the Nadal, Federer days to even now with Sinner and Alcaraz. I guess what's sort of the key to his longevity and how has he been able to sustain success for such a long period of time?
Uh, Discipline, monomaniacal focus. Um, he truly loves the game of tennis and he hates not winning. So, in order to keep on playing tennis and not be miserable, he has to win a majority of his matches, or else he would be, despondent. So, I think that need for winning, his love of tennis combined with the need to win, is what literally gets him up in the morning and has him meditating for a half hour in his backyard every day. I mean, one of the first times we spent time with him was in New York during the US Open in 2024. And if you've seen the film, at the end of the film, he's meditating in a park. That's Central Park. That's across the street from his hotel, which was on 59th. So he is steps away from traffic on Fifth Ave and 59th, right there. But he needed to go. If our cameras were there or not, he was going to do this. In fact, we had to kind of like just stealthily follow him to the park without being in his face. But he needed to do this as part of his preparation for a match he had later on that day. And if you need a blade of grass in New York City, you probably have to go to Central Park, and he was not willing to deviate from his routine in order to accommodate our cameras. It was just, there's a remarkable amount of discipline that goes into every day, every meal, every practice session. He is always, always hyper focused.
Yeah, that is an incredible scene in the film. And the other thing that's interesting about Djokovic, from many people's perspective, is it seems like he embraces the villain role in many ways, and especially with his reactions and relationship with the fans in the stands. Do you think that that maybe impacted him emotionally at all, or behind closed doors? And how do you sort of think he embraces this sort of villain perception?
I think he didn't have a choice but to embrace it
Hmm.
because it was funny when he was the Joker and he was doing impressions and he was kind of acting like a goofy young but fiercely talented player who every once in a while could pull a huge upset uh, out of the books, but largely stay know his role and stay underneath Roger and Rafa. People could tolerate him and enjoy him. It was when he started to threaten to eclipse them, and then he actually did eclipse them. That's when I think people started taking offense and being like, "Wait a second, this was a perfect story over here." And it's all
Hmm.
well and good that we have this goofy guy with a name we can't pronounce, speaking a language we can't understand, from a place we don't really aren't familiar with. Um, but you can't be the best. You're not allowed to actually be better than these guys. And he had no choice but to embrace that role and let it feed him. Because if he always wanted their affection and their love, then he would have been empty all the time. But I think instead, what motivated him the most, what has always motivated him the most, is being an underdog and being the guy that nobody expected to win any given tournament or any given major.
Yeah, and I bring up the villain sort of perception of him because obviously, I think it maybe came to a head back in 2022 with the vaccine situation when he was deported from the Australian Open. Eventually, that caused him to miss multiple tournaments as well. I guess, do you feel like that situation impacted the coverage around him and maybe impacted his career and maybe the public perception of him because of that?
Absolutely. It did with me. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm a casual tennis fan. I watch, the majors, and as a rabid sports fan, I know who the best are in each of their sports. But I'm not a tennis fan who'll be watching, round one of the Cincinnati Open this week.
Hmm.
Um, so I knew Novak as this guy who was polarizing and, the antics on the court and pretty stubborn and outspoken off the court. And then this vaccine thing happened. And what I understood that story to be was that he refused to be vaccinated and he was deported from Australia because of his refusal. But that's not what actually happened. And we go into that in the story. It's more complicated than that because you mentioned tournaments that he had missed. There were plenty of tournaments. And by the way, I disagree with him on this, and he knows
Hmm.
that. I disagreed with him then about not being vaccinated, and I disagree with him now, just from a public safety and public health standpoint. But I understood, and he was patient enough to take me through it. And I'd like to say I was patient enough to try and understand his point of view on this. But he had willingly missed big Grand Slams or all the Grand Slams before that. Like the US, he wasn't allowed to play in the US in some of the Masters tournaments, and he wasn't allowed to play at the US Open because of his refusal to be vaccinated. And he said, okay, fine. The
Hmm.
Australian Open invited him with a special exemption to come play. And it was only after he posted on Instagram, kind of flaunting that he was going over there unvaccinated,
Hmm.
that there was a public outcry in Australia because that entire country was on lockdown
Hmm.
as an island. So there's people, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who can't see their friends and family because of these restrictions, and yet they're inviting this big name sports star over to play. So he kind of got caught in the political crossfire once he landed on Australian ground, but he was invited to come over there and play. So to get that kind of perspective from him, I mean, my goal with any of these things, but especially with a character like Novak, is for people who have preconceptions like I did going in to at least have a better understanding of who the person is and why they act the way they do. I'm not
Mhm.
asking or expecting viewers to love Novak after they watch this. I'd be irresponsible if that was my goal. But my goal is to educate you on who he is, where he's from, and why he makes the decisions he makes and why he acts the way that he does. So that was the goal going into this, and that was my goal as a filmmaker and as a person to understand this guy a little bit more.
Let's dive into that in a moment about the creative process in all of this for a moment, because obviously, Michael Jordan, you've done so many other these great sports docs, but they've sort of evolved over time. And you mentioned obviously Novak was curious on how you were going to be doing the production of this. Is it sort of difficult to satisfy the athletes while still having creative control, while also still reaching into the deep questions that we are curious about, while uncovering the truth in all of this, which in many cases is unflattering to the athletes themselves?
It's the most difficult part of the job, is threading the needle between maintaining your own integrity as a filmmaker and making something that you can be proud of, making something that the audience wants to see. That's not just a puff piece. That's not all, because none of us are all villain and none of us are all hero. All
Mm-hmm.
of us are more complicated than that, not the least of which are these great athletes. So, as always, the subject is oftentimes the least reliable source of what's interesting about them. What Novak thinks is interesting about him is not what you or I would think is interesting about him.
Mm-hmm.
So, in some respects, the athlete or the subject says, "This is my story. I get to tell it the way I want to tell it. I'm giving you the access. I'm not going to let you do something that I don't like." But you need to establish trust with them and work with them over time to say, "Listen, if we don't show this aspect of you, if we don't show this vulnerable side of you, if we don't have this scene in the doc." Um, there's a scene when he's expressing deep ambivalence about his career and what it means to win and lose on the eve of a huge match, where
Mm-hmm.
he happened to let us into his home and he was getting physical therapy in his living room as his daughter was reading a book 8 feet away from him. And he was referring, I asked him, what's the hardest part? Is it harder mentally or physically now at this stage of your career? Expecting that he would say physically, it's impossible for me to rebound 48 hours later for a match the way that I could 10 years ago, 5 years ago, certainly 20
Mm-hmm.
years ago. But he said the mental was harder. And the answer that he gave is my favorite part of the doc. It is the doc. If I asked someone to watch 5 minutes of this documentary, it would be that one scene to get inside of a great athlete's head as they are 20 years down the road in their career and they've accomplished everything there is to accomplish. And their son and daughter are sitting right there waiting for their attention. And yet they're hooked up to all these machines to recover their muscles to playing yet another championship match. So that's interesting to me. He said, "Well, I don't feel that way anymore. I felt that way that night, but I don't feel that way now." But he may feel that way later on, and he did feel that way that night. And that's the best window I can give you and all the viewers into what it is like to be an athlete like this in the moment. So it's a very, very difficult needle to thread. Like I said, it is the hardest part of these documentaries, but it's also the challenge. It's fun as well.
We'll get you out of here on this, Jason. There's a lot of talk of LeBron having a documentary mimicking sort of similar to what you guys had done with The Last Dance. I'm curious, just your thoughts on that. Are you involved in that? And what do you sort of think maybe that story might tell as well?
I'm not involved in that at all, and I certainly I can't agree with you that it's going to try and mimic The Last Dance. I don't know what their plans are for
Hmm.
that. Obviously, LeBron is a towering figure in sports, maybe the sports figure of our generation, and deserves a true, comprehensive, long telling of his story. But I have no insight into what their plans are, and I'll be waiting to watch it just the same as you.
Well, the documentary is out on August the 20th. It's called Novak Djokovic, The Wolf in Winter on Prime Video. Director Jason Hehir, thank you so much for hanging out with us here at Front Office Sports.
Thanks, man. It was a pleasure.